The second that deals with radical gender ideology is Amendment number 333, and this deals with the use of certain DoD facilities. And I'm somewhat embarrassed I have to even offer this amendment, but I've received a number of complaints from female service members in my district who do not want to shower with other people who have male genitalia. And that is being required. I have, for the record, a number of pieces. I'll submit those, Mr. Chairman, at the committee's acceptance, but the amendment that I would offer would say that you use the shower and locker facilities of your gender assigned at birth. And it seems so obvious, it should probably be the way it's being dealt with now, but this is the direct consequence of feedback from female service members. And the committee did take testimony on this point, and we had General McGonville of the Army come in and say that it would most certainly hurt recruiting with young women to be if these circumstances continue to present where women are having to shower with biological men. On to my third and final gender ideology amendment. I don't believe that the military should pay for people's gender reassignment surgeries. They cost over $200,000, and there was one analysis done of $15 million that was spent by DoD on this gender reassignment, and about $3 million was spent on the actual surgeries, and then the remaining roughly $12 million was spent on all of the psychological care that is required for people who are suffering from gender dysphoria. I think if people want to realign their gender, they have every right to do so in this country. I don't think it should be a priority of the Department of Defense to pay for it. And that's why I've offered amendment number 320 on that point. The second bucket of issues I want to deal with, and I know it's a sensitive one, is abortion. And I know people have very different views on abortion. And I know that when it comes to various transit and travel, there'll be issues that deal with that. But my amendment precisely targets how abortion policy intersects with billeting and where service members are sent. The committee has developed evidence, and we have seen in public reporting that people are able to say that they're not going to go to a particular state that has military mission because they don't like that state's abortion policy. So regardless of how people feel about abortion, and I think reasonable people can disagree on this subject, I don't think that we should say that specific missions in red states should not be filled with billets and with people based on abortion policy. We should divorce those questions, but unfortunately they're being merged now. And we're seeing that play out not only in the fulfillment of mission that occurs regularly, but even the selection of where the U.S. Space Command will be. There's been indication that that's a factor. I just don't think abortion should be a factor in basing decisions. That's amendment number 285. Third basket, DEI. I want to commend the committee's work on this point, particularly Chairman Banks and the Military Personnel Subcommittee. We have taken a meat cleaver to DEI already in the underlying bill. The unfinished work is Amendment 314, which I've offered, which ends all DEI funding. Already in the base bill, we say that there can be no critical race theory pedagogy in any form of training at any of our service academies. We already say that senior DEI officials can't make these exorbitant salaries, but this would simply wipe that out altogether. And there's a reason for that. The DEI experiment in our military has failed. We recall the first act of Secretary Austin was this white supremacy stand down. But now we've seen reporting that was resisted so heavily by service members. That was such a negative thing for cohesion and unity that they've actually tried to de-emphasize the white supremacy snipe hunt that they seem to be on. The second manifestation of this DEI in our military that I want to draw attention to is the promotion packets. When Secretary Austin took his position, he initially required the removal of photographs from officer promotion packets because his assertion was that if you had a photograph on a promotion packet and the person was of a different race or color or creed than you, that you would have some implicit inherent bias against that person. And so under the guise of DEI, we then removed all the photos from the promotion packets. And did the officer corps become more diverse? No, it became less diverse. And so Secretary Austin had to go reverse that decision he had previously made. Let us liberate ourselves from these flawed decisions and the cancerous doctrine of DEI. Finally, the committee developed evidence particularly about how DEI is harmful in the DoD's education mission. When we put up the tweets and messages that some of these DEI officials had, they said that white people should not be able to claim that anyone else is racist other than white people. They talked about being Caucasian being something that caused people to, just being Caucasian caused you to discriminate against others. And Secretary Austin and General Milley and the other DEI proponents at DOD were so embarrassed by this, after the testimony, they literally shut down the entire program at DODOA. So if that's happening there, it is metastasized across the enterprise of DOD, and that is why Amendment 314 is so important. The fourth bucket that I would draw the committee's attention to is the COVID reinstatement matter. I have Amendment number 296 that would give the Secretary 180 days to reinstate all those who sought reinstatement with the restoration of their pay and their rank, and it would provide a flat $15,000 hardship bonus for those who've seen their lives turned upside down by a COVID mandate that was never founded in science and obviously has been rescinded as a consequence of the inability to continue to defend it. We lost 8,600 service members. We lost hundreds of special operators. We lost over 700 pilots. Our military is not stronger today because of the COVID vaccine mandate. It is weaker today, and anyone who is being honest would have to ascribe to that fact. The fourth area that I wanted to talk about was the issue of civil liberties. And I have three amendments on civil liberties. There is something that exists called the Joint Staff Civil Disturbance Cell. And I've been on the Armed Services Committee for 7 years. I had never heard of the Joint Staff Civil Disturbance Cell until they started labeling the social media content of members of Congress as extremist. So that you know this, the DOD today funds a domestic entity that tries to dictate what content online is true or false. And just as we oppose a ministry of truth in DHS, we similarly oppose a ministry of truth in DOD. And I want to submit for the record a piece from Trimix.com that highlights a social media post from Congresswoman Green and Congresswoman Boebert.
Without objection.
Thank you. And in this report, the tweets aren't particularly grievous. Ms. Green's tweet says that she woke up laughing about what a bunch of moron Democrats are giving free time to someone for. The Democrat tyrannical government is problematic. Conservatives have no say on committees. Editorial, no doubt, but dangerous, probably not. Ms. Boebert issued a tweet talking about just criticizing Secretary Austin's extremism stand down. A stand down, the policy that undergirded that stand down has subsequently been abandoned by the Department of Defense. But because Ms. Boebert offered a criticism, a DOD entity labeled her as extremist. Look, the Department of Defense does not have a constitutional mandate or the responsibility to label speech as credible or illegitimate, yet they are doing it anyway. This amendment would abolish the funding for the civil disturbance cell and would have the DOD focused on their core mission. That amendment number is 1423. And the final civil liberty amendment I have is Amendment 317 relating to cannabis. I do not believe we should be testing for cannabis for people who want to join the military. We have seen cannabis policy at the federal level awry for a long time, and we should be thinking about cannabis more in terms of alcohol. And because cannabis stays in the system so much longer than other drugs, someone cannot even be a drug user with great proximity to their desire to enlist or commission and yet can deem themselves somehow ineligible to serve. We are having a recruiting crisis. Under most states in this country, people use cannabis under the color of state law, and certainly my amendment would not prohibit the Department of Defense from disallowing cannabis for people who are actually in the military, but for people who seek to be in the military, it seems like an unnecessary gate that we continue to maintain. The committee has received evidence that the areas that are specifically impaired by this policy are AI, cyber, coding, at times intel, because sometimes when people are in college or wherever, they use cannabis while goofing off, and maybe that shouldn't be a reason they shouldn't be able to express their patriotism through military service. Again, that cannabis amendment is 317. The final basket that I want to talk about is Ukraine. My amendment 1206 strips all the Ukraine money out of this bill, about $300 million. And what I think you've heard from people who feel strongly on the Ukraine issue is that these should be divided questions. I know that I'm in the minority of the majority with my view on the Ukraine war. I'm in the minority when it comes to the overall House of Representatives. But this issue of whether or not the United States should continue to be involved in this war in Ukraine should not be commingled with these other critical questions about how we're going to operate the Department of Defense. Whether you're for the war in Ukraine or you're against the war in Ukraine and the U.S. involvement, it at least is an issue that deserves its own dignity and its own vote. And the National Defense Authorization Act should not have to carry the Ukraine funding as an anchor. There's a second Ukraine amendment that I have that's a bit more targeted, amendment number 326, and this deals with end-use monitoring. Okay, so when we had the Inspector General before us and we asked questions in the committee, are we complying with end-use monitoring when it comes to Ukraine? They could not answer the question yes. So the only thing that Amendment 326 requires is a certification by the Secretary of Defense that we are following our own laws when it comes to end-use monitoring of this equipment. We know we haven't done it right the whole time. I think we should at least have to certify that we're following the law as we're sending weapons of war into a killing zone. And the final amendment I'll ask you to support is one where I join my colleague, Ms. Jacobs, and the ranking member of the Rules Committee to stop the exportation of cluster bombs. Mr. McGovern had a freestanding piece of legislation on this that I think correctly laid out what the international norms are regarding cluster bombs. And as I've heard our colleagues who support this decision defend cluster bombs, it seems to fall into two categories. One, well, Russia's using them and has them. Just because Russia has something, we're going to give it to Ukraine. What are we going to send tactical nuclear weapons next? Since the point that my colleague Mr. Davidson made, is the objective here to get Ukraine on some sort of military parity with Russia? If so, the cluster bombs would seem like a bizarre place to start anyway. And then the second argument made in favor of the cluster bombs is, well, they're only going to use them in their own country. How craven and depraved is that? We are still cleaning up cluster bombs now in Laos because of the high dud rate. These things go down, and you're going to have children with lost limbs and parents that they don't have anymore because of this decision. And the fact that a country is willing to use it within their own boundaries in no way absolves us of the responsibility of sending them there when those folks die. So I hope you'll consider that as a bipartisan amendment as well, and I yield back.